Hello everybody, welcome back to Psych of Adjustment, and we're going to talk about personality today. So this is a big module, I warn you, and this is a critical module to the course for a couple reasons. Understanding personality theory certainly is at the heart of a lot of adjustment strategies that they kind of derive from different personality theories. So we get to explore all those, and also especially for paper 2, this becomes critically important to kind of frame or to locate what you're thinking in the book that you read, and then the subsequent musings of that potential philosopher or psychologist as a self-help strategy. So theory becomes all important in this regard. Here we have Thomas Sad's nice opening quote, I think. People often say that this or that person has not yet found himself, but the self isn't something that one necessarily finds, at least according to Satz. It's something that one creates, and we're going to return to this theme a couple times through this lecture and through the course itself. So consider that. Is personality something that you just passively discover through some form of exploration, or is it something that you actively engineer throughout your lifespan? So what is personality? Well, it can be defined simply as a distinct pattern of behavior, thoughts, right? Feelings that characterize a person's perception of and adjustment to the demands of life. So if we look at trait-level theories of personality, how do optimists and pessimists differ in this regard, right? What we find is personality is relatively stable by adolescence, and that, kind of when we talked about the self and we talked about Erickson and the identity crisis and James Marcia, we see it stabilized during adolescence and pretty much should remain stable throughout the lifespan. Is it possible to change? Sure. Do people grow and attain wisdom? Maybe they do. Annika, what are you doing, Annika? She's all wound up right now. Come on. You want to go up top? Come on. Let's go up there, sweetie. There you go. All right, that's a good girl. All right, so one of the reasons for this lecture is that historically theorists have had different views of personality, right? So then the psychological qualities that bring continuity to an individual's behavior in different situations at different times, this aspect of the definition, I think, as a social psychologist becomes all important. Because a social psychologist is first and foremost about the power of the situation, how the situation affects us. But when you consider then personality, it's like, how are we consistent across different situations? So I really like to think of personality psychology and social psychology as two sides of a coin. And our richest understanding of human behavior and our best ability to predict human behavior is the result of considering the person in the situation, and Kurt Lewin would certainly support that idea. Now, some personality theorists will talk about personality that's construed as a cluster of traits. At the end of this lecture, we will take a look at that, and that'll be one of your homework opportunities as well. So, what is a trait then? It's a characteristic of an individual being described as habitual way of thinking, behaving, or perceiving. Now, the history of personality goes way back. We won't belabor it too much, but we always have to talk about Hippocrates, because Hippocrates, right, 5th century BC. So think about that. We're talking 2,500 years ago, and Hippocrates, well, if you become a doctor, what do you have to take? You have to take the Hippocratic Oath. It's named for Hippocrates, right? And he was a scientist, and he believed that illness could be explained rationally in terms of physical processes rather than possession by spirits or demons. So that's a pretty significant shift in thinking 2,500 years ago. And he described the four humors. These are four bodily fluids, right, that in fact must be maintained in balance. And that's a critical aspect, is thinking in terms of balance. Carl Jung is going to pick up on that much later, not that far in our lecture, but much later as far as real time. So if someone is excessively cheerful and active, they may have too much blood, right? And so they have a sanguine personality is the way it's, and that means too much blood. If they're, apathetic and sluggish, they have a phlegmatic personality, too much phlegm. So then, Hippocrates was one of the first doctors, so now he's going to prescribe some kind of solution to this, physically based, so he might give an expectorant, if you will, right, to get rid of one's phlegm. Black bile, of course, this is, the kind of the poop deal, right? And I love the description sad and brooding, because I imagine, someone who's sad and brooding, someone who's constipated, sitting there on the toilet wishing they could go poo. And of course, Hippocrates is going to give them a laxative to straighten them out and bring them back into balance, right? Finally, yellow bile, and this is, have you ever heard the term getting pissed off? Well, this is about urine, right? And this is retaining the urine and makes someone irritable and excitable. So you can see how these physical aspects and the need to balance them, Hippocrates is all about this. And yet we still have carryovers 2,500 years later in our language. So let's move to some more modern theories, if you will. And I want to start with psychodynamic theories. And psychodynamic, right? Psyche in conflict. And when we think psychodynamic, who do we think first and foremost? Is it this young man? I don't know what this has to do anything, but I love this picture. Fighting the demons within and without, perhaps. But yeah, you're right. We probably think in terms of Sigmund Freud, right? So psychodynamic theories are really personality. Successful adjustment are characterized by this struggle, right, between aspects of the mind, aspects of the personality. And Sigmund Freud's theory then, Freud, he believed that the mind was like an iceberg, right, and it was comprised of the ego, superego, and id. And it's these elements that are in conflict that create this dynamic process of reconciling desires with constraints, right, in some rational manner. And the desires are id-driven, the pleasure principle, right? The constraints are the superego, and that's the moral guardian. And then finally, the ego is the rational part of us who tries to keep the id and the superego from beating up on each other too significantly. So, I think that's a beautiful metaphor for the mind from Sigmund Freud. You're going to find I'm a Freud fan. Sure, he made a lot of mistakes and he said a lot of strange things, but and we'll move through that. But let's face it, this dynamic aspect of the multiple aspects of us that need to be held in check or in conflict and present us with adjustment challenges, right? And then the conscious and unconscious. And I think, man, wow, is that a big deal or what? To think in terms of we have this unconscious mind. And as Freud said originally, 1/7 of the mind is accessible. That would be the conscience. The other 6/7 sit below the waterline, as is the case with an iceberg. So that's really the essence of the metaphor. Over time, we're now saying maybe conscious is 10%, non-conscious 90%, but some neuroscientists are going as far as maybe saying, hey, you probably have conscious access to about 2% of your brain, and 98% is unconscious or non-conscious processes. And please don't be confused by the terminology non-conscious versus unconscious. Freud and his ilk used the term unconscious. Later, social psychologists, when we get into the 80s and 90s, 1980s, 1990s, to avoid being identified too strongly with the non-empirically oriented Sigmund Freud, but we wanted to explore the unconscious. I think a lot of social psychologists at that point, empirically minded social psychologists, went for the term non-conscious, right? The meaning is you'd be too nitpicky to try and differentiate the two. So, Freud's psychoanalytic theory, then, we've got the unconscious. This is the domain that the individual is not aware. Storehouse for repressed impulses. So that is, we may have impulses that we do not wish to satisfy or are afraid to satisfy, so we push them down into the unconscious, right? That's where the drives hang out, and we'll talk about the drives that Freud suggested, the conflicts that we no longer want to entertain or participate in. We shove all that stuff down into the unconscious. Kind of like the closet in your house that receives the gifts that you don't want to display in your home. It's like putting stuff in the attic or the garage or the basement so that you don't have to look at it on a day-to-day basis. Now, the conflicts are at the heart of psychodynamic personality theory, and they manifest themselves in maladaptive thoughts and behaviors. So that's the issue, and that's the problem. So according to psychodynamic personality theory, we're beings of conflict, and these conflicts often interfere with our ability to negotiate life's challenges. Right? So you can imagine that it's a matter of aligning these aspects of the id, the superego, and the ego. And we can define each pretty briefly here. The id, then, is the primitive. It's the unconscious part of the personality. It's got the most basic drives stored in it, and repressed memories that are too painful for us to recall, we put down there, right? So whether it's your attic or your basement, it's the lowest part, so maybe we call it the basement of us. Now, the superego is where we maintain a list of our values. This is where our moral attitudes are placed, right? And as you can think, well, where did these come from? Right? These are not artifacts of birth. This is largely learned, right? And so it has a cultural element as well. But it's our parents, right? Who else told you how you should behave? What's right and wrong? Yeah, right? It's your relationship with your religion. Religion often tells us what is acceptable, moral, or immoral, right? But the laws of society have the same function as well. And so this is a well-developed superego. Then manifests itself as your conscience, and when you violate the rules, then your conscience bothers you, right? And you feel guilty, and that's a huge aspect of this. Now, the ego, right, is the conscious part of the brain. So we have access, that's the ego, and really the responsibility is the ego provides these impulses. I want it. The superego says, hey, you can't have it, right? And the ego is trying to sort all this shit out. So, you know, it wants to maintain the rules of the superego, but it also wants to satisfy the id if that's at all possible, and that's the conflict. So it's like the cartoon, the classic cartoon, right, where we have the angel on one shoulder that says, oh, you must not do that, right? And then you have the devil on the other shoulder who's saying, do it, you know it'll feel good. No, you must. Oh, it'll feel great, right? And we're in the middle, and that's, I love psychodynamic theory, because we have this experience resonates with us of being torn between doing the right thing or doing what we want to do when they don't line up, right? So, Freud's model of the mind, then, what do we have? Well, we have the id down there below the waterline, right? We have the ego, and then we have the superego. And notice, sometimes we're not thinking about the rules, or so they're not necessarily available to us at a given time, but if we start thinking about them, then they bubble on up and we can consciously process them. Well, here is where Freud and psychodynamic psychologists in general get into problems. Because if it's unconscious, if we don't know about it, then how do we identify it? How do we process it? And how do we empirically support any evidence in this regard? And that, of course, was one of the biggest arguments against Freud, was there was little to no empirical support, right? But we want to dig out these conflicts that people are suffering from in a therapeutic sense, so we need to explore their unconscious. Freud was a big fan of word association, so he would say a word, and then you say the first word that pops into your mind. The idea is that the word serves as a conscious stimuli that triggers an unconscious response. That is, the unconscious pushes up the response word, and from the pattern of response words, we can see what's kind of brewing in the unconscious. So word association was a big way to get at this, right? But projective tests are another way to do this, and that is we show someone an ambiguous image and then ask them to explain it, and there's no real meaning that can be consciously derived. So as we attempt to explain it, it's the unconscious contents that are being projected onto the ambiguous projective test. Now, what do you think? What are those tests called? Yeah, it's the Rorschach, and then the thematic apperception tests are two of the most well-known, right? And these projective personality tests that are derived from the belief that the unconscious contents will be projected onto ambiguous stimuli, right? Two examples then, let's take a look at them. Let's look at the Rorschach ink blot test. So here you are at home, and maybe it's good that we aren't doing this in a live class, because I project this on the screen and I ask people to describe it. And of course, then they're presenting, they're hidden, right? They're unconscious or not, right? But, so, the idea here is, I ask you, so what's going on here? The person's asked to report what you see. Now, the way this was constructed, and it's probably important to mention that, right, is what we do is put some ink, random ink spots on this side of the paper while it's still wet, right? We fold it over and then we unfold it so we have the mirror image on the opposite side in this particular projective test. So I ask you, what do you see? Now, there is some empirical support for the use of the Rorschach, at least in what constitutes a common or uncommon response. Now, how many of you might be tempted to say, it looks like two women bent over a cooking pot? Well, a lot of people say that. That is, in fact, a very common interpretation. Some people might mention butterflies, right? That it could look like a butterfly, or that's a butterfly in the center. And, if you show this to 1,000 people, you can kind of quantify the nature of the responses. But what if you showed me this and I said, well, it looks like my mother and I fighting over the last piece of cake that she just pulled out of the refrigerator. And you go, really? Huh, okay. Now, if I give similar responses that communicate conflict about this person in my life, let's say, then what we're doing is suggesting that maybe that's conflict that I've repressed and is now coming to the surface through the interpretation of the ambiguous image. So these are standardized. There's a bunch of them, and they have some kind of there's books devoted to cataloging the potential responses and how often those responses occur. But ultimately, the empirical support for what that actually means is lacking. Right? So we don't see a whole lot of psychodynamic therapy anymore. It's expensive, it takes a long time, and it's not empirically supported. But it is a projective test, no clear image. Now, the thematic apperception test is another way to get at this. And notice that it largely explores relationships between people. So in this test, what I would say is, okay, what do you got going here? And now, tell me the story of this picture. And as a therapist, I can use this as a talking point. I can say, what happened prior to this moment? What's happening at this moment? And what do you think is likely to happen after this? What's the nature of the relationship of these people? Right? And again, we're trying to bring unconscious content up to the light of the day where we can explore them with the client, right? And in that way, it might be useful just as a conversation starter, if nothing else. But largely not supported because of its lack of empirical reliability and validity. So, Freud's psychoanalytic theory, well, and this is where it maybe gets a little weird. I'm going to reinterpret Freud a little bit, and I hope that you're willing to go along with me in this case. Now, it does demonstrate a certain amount of hubris on my part to think that I can actually reinterpret Sigmund Freud. But there's some ideas that have helped me, I think, understand Freud better, and I just hope to share them with you in this case. Freud talked about us developing through psychosexual stages and their successive instinctive patterns associating pleasure with stimulation of certain specific body areas at different stages in life. And you say, well, how can a frickin' 3-year-old have sexual pleasure? And it's not really, I know everyone says that Freud's about sex, but I think if we step back and substitute sensual pleasure instead of sexual pleasure, that is pleasure derived by bodily sensation, I think it makes a little more sense, and it's a little easier to interpret than just say, oh, Freud's crazy, he's about sex and children, that doesn't exist, so I will dismiss him. If we substitute the notion sensual pleasure, then we can look at where does an infant receive its greatest amount of pleasure, and that would be the mouth. Right? It uses the mouth to nurse or to feed, and that's a pleasurable activity. And you can see that an agitated infant given a bottle or given the breast then calms down and changes in its nature at that point in time because it's a pleasurable circumstance. Thumb sucking, pacifiers, right? These are all meant to satisfy the urge for pleasure, which at this stage of development is centered in the mouth. And I think that's the issue there. Now, the anal stage, I know, oh my God, are we going to go there? But now, when we enter into toddlerhood and it's a time of potty training, there can be a great deal of sensual satisfaction derived from either tightening or loosening the sphincter muscle, right? Tightening to control the bowel movements, to control the bowels, and also with the prostate to control the urine flow, right? So this becomes then the source of pleasure. And notice, but it also becomes a source of developing control. So it becomes hugely important in that aspect. Now after this, when we get into, let's say, 3 to 7, 3 to 8, whatever, children discover that they have genitals, and notice Freud's sexist, so penis figures largely in this, but they understand that touching their genital area gives them pleasure, right? So it's the phallic stage. Now, they're not capable of orgasm or anything like that at this age, so we're not going there, but it's just there's a lot of nerve endings, right? Either around the penis or the clitoris, right? And those are becoming active so that they, in fact, there's pleasurable sensations when contact is made with those. Now, the latency stage come around 10 years old, and 10 years old is important for a lot of child developmental people. Nothing's going on at all. So Freud's going to call it the latency stage. Nothing to see here, folks. And then finally, the genital stage. This is when we attain puberty and we can become sexually active beings. So, part 1, boom, done. Part 2, coming up.